The land between the two rivers, Mesopotamia, was a world of beginnings. Here the Tigris and Euphrates cut through plains of fertile soil, flooding and receding, with a rhythm that both nourished and destroyed. It was a place where human hands first pressed clay into bricks, where reeds became pens, and where symbols etched upon wet tablets carried thoughts across time. Long before empires stretched across continents, this was a land of fragmented powers. Cities rose from the dust, each surrounded by walls, each with its patron god, its armies, its pride. Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Ur, Nippur. These were not just names, but living forces, rival brothers in an endless struggle for dominance. In these cities, kings claimed divinity or favor from the gods. Their temples rose like stairways into the sky, their ziggurats a challenge to the heavens themselves. Priests dictated the calendar, reading omens from the stars and the liver of sacrificed animals. Armies marched across the floodplains, their bronze-tipped spears glittering in the sun. Yet as quickly as one city might rise, another would challenge its supremacy. Wars were constant, fought not for conquest of vast territories, but for water rights, for fertile fields, for pride, and for the favor of the gods. No ruler had yet forged a lasting unity. The Sumerian world was fractured, and though its people had built wonders and invented the tools of civilization, they remained divided. It was into this world that the legend of a man began to take shape. His story was whispered as if it were myth, carried in fragments by poets who compared him to heroes of divine birth. Later scribes would tell of a child abandoned upon the river, sealed in a basket of reeds, cast adrift like the infant Moses of later tales, or like Romulus, abandoned to the Tiber. This child, it was said, was rescued and raised by a gardener, nurtured by humble hands yet destined for greatness. His name would be remembered as Sargon, Sharukin, in the tongue of Akkad, meaning the true king, the legitimate ruler. Yet legitimacy was not granted to him by blood or tradition. It was forged through conquest, through ambition, and through a vision that surpassed the narrow walls of the city-state. But before Sargon could rise, the world around him needed to ripen for change. For centuries, the Sumerian kings had tested one another in battle. They had pushed the boundaries of their city-states, but none had the strength to bend all others to their will. The land was too divided, the loyalties too deep, the gods too numerous. Yet in this constant struggle, the seeds of empire were sown. Cities grew rich on trade, exchanging grain for timber, copper and lapis lazuli brought from distant mountains. Soldiers became hardened through unending campaigns. Administrators learned to track harvests and taxes with the cuneiform script, while priests codified rituals that bound communities together. Civilization was preparing itself for something greater, though its people did not yet know it. Into this volatile crucible stepped Sargon. Some accounts place him at Kish, serving as a cupbearer to the king, an intimate but dangerous position where loyalty and treachery walked hand in hand. From here he learned the workings of power, the fragile nature of kingship, the arrogance of rulers who believed their gods alone made them invincible. But Sargon was no mere servant. Whether by fate or by his own cunning, he turned opportunity into destiny. He seized power, and from that moment began the relentless march toward an ambition the world had never seen before. The creation of an empire that would outlive the breath of any single king. The story of Sargon is as much myth as it is history. The ancient scribes who recorded his deeds were not chroniclers in the modern sense, but poets of power, shaping narratives to awe and inspire. They told of a king who ruled from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, who crushed the Sumerian cities under his heel, who established Akkad as the beating heart of a new world order. They told of a man favored by the goddess Ishtar, who marched with divine protection, whose enemies were scattered like broken reeds before a storm. To his enemies he was a conqueror who left ruin in his wake, To his followers, he was the chosen king, the true king, the one who had achieved what none before him had dared to dream. Yet beneath the myth lies the reality of a man who harnessed the strengths of his age. He commanded disciplined armies armed with bronze weapons. He built a system of governors loyal not to local gods, but to his own throne. He placed Akkad as the center of power, and he crushed rebellion with a swiftness that terrified all who opposed him. His empire was not merely the sum of conquered cities. It was a new vision, one in which many peoples, tongues, and lands were bound together under a single ruler. This was the birth of the First Empire, and it began with Sargon's audacity to claim more than any man before him. The winds of Mesopotamia carried both dust and prophecy. The same rivers that nourished life could destroy it in a single flood. To the Sumerians, this chaos reflected the will of capricious gods, unpredictable and powerful. But Sargon's vision defied this cycle. He sought permanence, order imposed by human hands, unity enforced by might and by law. His rise was not merely the rise of a king, it was the transformation of civilization itself. From his empire would flow lessons that every conqueror after him would study, consciously or not. The necessity of loyalty, the use of language and administration to unify, the role of terror and propaganda to maintain power. Rome, Persia, even the empires of modern memory, all carried echoes of Akkad. And so the tale begins with the abandoned child of legend, lifted from the river by chance or by the hand of the gods, raised among the lowly, yet carrying within him the seed of empire. His was a world of rivals, of walls that cut the plains into jealous fragments, of kings who dreamed small dreams beneath vast skies. But Sargon dreamed larger. His destiny was not to guard a city's gates, but to break them down, not to defend a single ziggurat, but to bend nations to his will. His life would be the turning of an age, and his name would echo across millennia as the first great emperor, the conqueror who created the first empire. The dust of conquest had scarcely settled when the true test of Sargon's vision began. To crush cities in battle was one thing, but to hold them, to bend their ancient traditions into a single unity, required something greater than force. It required invention, organization, and an understanding of human ambition. Sargon had not only created an empire through his victories, he now faced the challenge of keeping it alive. The Sumerian city-states had long histories, older than Akkad itself. Their priests held sway over people through rituals and offerings, claiming the authority of gods who had watched over each city since time immemorial. Their farmers were bound to the land by irrigation systems that demanded cooperation, while their merchants looked beyond their walls for profit and exchange. To disrupt this balance was to risk constant revolt. Yet to leave it untouched was to risk disintegration, the return to the old rivalries that had plagued the land. Sargon understood this delicate tension. He did not seek to erase Sumerian culture, but to dominate it, to subsume it into something larger. His empire was not ruled from temples, but from a throne that reached across city boundaries. He appointed governors known as ensis, officials whose loyalty was not to the local gods, but to Akkad itself. These men, often chosen from his closest supporters, became his hands in distant provinces. They collected tribute, oversaw justice, and ensured the flow of resources into the heart of the empire. To prevent rebellion, Sargon employed a strategy of displacement, moving populations from one region to another so that no single city retained the power to defy him. Soldiers from Akkad were stationed in conquered territories, both to protect and to intimidate, their presence a reminder that the king's reach was long. The military itself became a tool not only of conquest, but of administration. Sargon is remembered as one of the first rulers to maintain a standing army. Soldiers loyal to the state, not merely levied from city militias for temporary campaigns. These men became the backbone of Akkadian power, disciplined and professional, capable of marching far beyond the boundaries of Mesopotamia. With them, Sargon projected authority across a vast expanse, striking fear into enemies and stamping out dissent before it could grow. The sight of Akkadian troops on the horizon was enough to quell unrest in many places, their reputation as conquerors spreading faster than their footsteps. But power was more than soldiers and governors. It was also the art of narrative. Sargon crafted his own legend with care, presenting himself as chosen by the goddess Ishtar, beloved of the gods, the rightful ruler not just of Akkad, but of all lands. Inscriptions and stelae proclaimed his victories, etching into stone the memory of his achievements so that his name would endure long after his enemies were dust. He was not content to be seen as a mere king. He was the king of the four quarters, lord of all lands, a title that stretched his authority beyond geography into myth. The Akkadian language itself became a tool of unification. While Sumerian remained the sacred tongue of priests and scribes, Akkadian, his language, spread across the empire, carried by officials, merchants, and soldiers. In time it would become the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, a common thread binding diverse peoples together. This linguistic shift was not immediate, but it was profound, laying the groundwork for a cultural unity that outlasted even the empire itself. Trade too flourished under his rule. Sargon recognized that wealth was the lifeblood of empire. From the mountains of Anatolia came silver and timber. From the east in Elam, copper flowed into his workshops. From the Indus Valley, through winding trade routes, came beads and precious stones. The Persian Gulf became a highway of commerce, carrying goods from distant lands into Akkadian markets. These connections brought not only riches but also prestige, for the empire stood at the crossroads of the ancient world, a hub through which the products of many lands flowed. Yet empire is never without cost. Rebellions flared like sparks in dry fields, threatening to undo what Sargon had built. The city of Ur, proud in its traditions, rose against him. Lagash tested his resolve. The mountains of the north resisted his reach. Each rebellion demanded his presence. Each victory required blood. It is said that in the last years of his reign, the cities of Sumer rose against him more than once, yet each time he crushed them with ruthless efficiency. His enemies must have seen him as relentless as the floods of the rivers, impossible to resist, inevitable in his return. But Sargon's empire was more than sword and fire. It was also vision. He established Akkad, his capital, as the jewel of the new order, a city that became both symbol and center of his rule. Though its ruins remain lost to us, swallowed by time and shifting rivers, the memory of Akkad endured in the texts of later generations. Poets and scribes spoke of its magnificence, its markets filled with the goods of the world, its palaces gleaming with the wealth of many lands. Akkad was not merely a city. It was the heart of the First Empire, the pulse of a vision that stretched across horizons. To his subjects, Sargon must have seemed larger than life, a figure who defied the ordinary boundaries of kingship. He had risen from obscurity to dominate the known world, forging something that had never existed before. In him, myth and reality blended. Was he the child cast upon the river, saved by chance or fate? Or was that tale woven after his rise, a narrative to cloak ambition in divine providence? The truth is lost, but the story itself reveals how his people understood him, not merely as a man, but as a figure destined, chosen, inevitable. The empire was now real, not just dreamed. Its armies marched far, its officials governed wide, its wealth poured inward. Yet the larger the empire grew, the greater the strain upon its foundations. Every expansion stretched its resources thinner. Every conquest invited the seeds of rebellion. For now, Sargon held it firm, but shadows always lurked on the horizon. The empire was an experiment, new and untested, and its survival depended on the strength of one man. As the old kings of Sumer faded into memory, replaced by governors of Akkad, the people must have wondered what future awaited them. Was this new order permanent, or merely another turn in the endless cycle of rise and fall? To Sargon, the answer was clear. His empire was eternal, his legacy unbreakable. Yet history would prove otherwise. For now, however, he stood unchallenged, master of Mesopotamia, the first emperor in human history. The child of the river grew into a man whose name carried whispers even before his armies marched. Sargon of Akkad, Sharukin, the true king, did not inherit a throne through bloodlines sanctified by temples. His beginnings were too humble, too shadowed by obscurity. Yet in this very obscurity lay his strength, for he owed allegiance to no dynasty, no priestly caste, no ancient lineage that chained him to tradition. He was a man carved by ambition, sharpened by necessity, and tempered in the fires of service at the court of Kish. It was there, in the company of kings, that he learned the fragile art of rule, watching how power could be lost as quickly as it was gained. The city of Kish was one of the great rivals among the Sumerian powers, a city whose rulers claimed authority over all of Sumer by divine right. To serve as cupbearer, there was no small thing. It placed Sargon at the side of the king, close enough to pour his wine, close enough to listen to secrets spoken in confidence, close enough to study the rhythms of a ruler's court. Yet it also placed him in a dangerous position. For to serve so near the throne was to tempt suspicion, and ambition could not remain hidden forever. The legends say that when the time was ripe, Sargon struck, whether through a palace coup, or through battlefield triumph, or through betrayal woven in whispers, the throne of Kish fell into his hands. In that moment, Sargon stepped from the shadows of service into the glaring light of kingship. But kingship of a single city was not his destiny. Sargon's vision reached beyond the clay walls and crowded streets of Kish. The fractious world of Sumer was ripe for a conqueror bold enough to seize it. Each city claimed dominion, yet each was vulnerable, locked in endless rivalry, draining its strength in battles against neighbors. For centuries no man had broken this cycle. But Sargon was no ordinary king. He saw not merely cities, but a land waiting to be bound, a people waiting to be ruled under a single banner. It was this vision that set him apart, and it was this vision that propelled him into the wars that would forge the world's first empire. The chronicles tell us of his first campaigns. Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, proud and ancient, was among his early targets. To defeat Uruk was to strike at the heart of Sumerian pride, to challenge the weight of centuries of myth and history. Sargon marched with soldiers hardened by ambition, men who followed him not because of ancient tradition, but because of promises of plunder and glory. The clash was brutal, the struggle fierce, but the outcome was inevitable. Uruk, the jewel of Sumer, fell. Its king, Lugalzagesi, once the most powerful among the Sumerian lords, was bound in chains and brought before Sargon. Some stories say he was paraded like a captured animal, humiliated before the temples of Akkad. It was more than conquest. It was theater, a declaration to all of Mesopotamia that a new power had risen, one that none could withstand. From Uruk, the campaign spread like fire across dry grass. One by one, the city-states of Sumer fell beneath Sargon's armies. Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Umma, ancient centers of worship and trade, humbled and bound into a new order. Each conquest was not merely a victory of arms, but a reordering of the world. Sargon did not destroy these cities. Instead, he wove them into his design, leaving their temples standing, their priests in place, but ensuring their loyalty lay not with local kings, but with the throne of Akkad. For the first time in history, the separate threads of Mesopotamian civilization were drawn together under a single ruler. The transformation was not accomplished by force alone. Sargon was as much a master of image as of war. He understood that power must be seen to be believed. His victories were proclaimed across the land, carved into stone, recited by scribes, carried on the lips of messengers to the farthest reaches of his domain. He claimed the favor of Ishtar, the goddess of war and love, presenting himself not merely as a conqueror, but as the chosen of the divine. To resist him was not only to defy a man, but to defy the will of the heavens. In this, Sargon revealed the true genius of empire. Conquest was the foundation, but belief was the cement that held it together. The rise of Akkad marked more than the triumph of one man. It was the birth of something new in human history. Before Sargon, kings ruled cities. After Sargon, kings would dream of ruling worlds. His armies marched beyond the Sumerian plains, reaching into territories the city-states had never controlled. To the east, he extended his power into Elam, humbling its cities and drawing its people into his growing domain. To the north, he pushed into the mountains, securing timber and metals to fuel his empire. To the west, his banners reached the Mediterranean, where the waves crashed against the shore in endless rhythm, a sight that must have filled his soldiers with awe. From the sunrise to the sunset, Sargon claimed dominion, a phrase that would echo in the boasts of kings for centuries to come. Yet with each conquest came the challenge of holding what had been taken. The city-states of Sumer did not forget their independence lightly. Rebellions flared, priests muttered against foreign rule, rival lords plotted in secret. But Sargon was relentless. Each uprising was crushed with ruthless swiftness, each challenger broken and cast down. The lesson was clear. The empire of Akkad would not be unmade by defiance. Through fear and loyalty, through reward and punishment, Sargon bound the land together. Still, he knew that swords alone could not hold such a vast realm. He built a system of governors and officials, appointed not from ancient dynasties, but from those loyal to him personally. He placed Akkad at the center of power, a city that became both symbol and reality of empire. Its walls rose with new strength, its temples gleamed with the offerings of conquered lands, its markets overflowed with goods brought from distant regions. Akkad became the heart that pumped life into a body of many peoples, a city whose name would become legendary even as its ruins vanished beneath the sands of time. The world was changing. Where once Sumer had been a patchwork of rival cities, now there was unity under a single ruler. Where once kings had been bound by the narrow horizons of their walls, now there was a vision that stretched across the horizon itself. Sargon had created something entirely new, an empire that transcended the city-state, a political form that would dominate human history from that moment onward. In his victories lay the blueprint for all who would follow. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. All would walk in the shadow of Sargon of Akkad, the man who dared to call himself the true king. At the height of his reign, Sargon of Akkad stood as a figure whose power seemed unmatched, whose reach stretched farther than any king before him. The Sumerian cities lay subdued, their walls broken, their kings humiliated, their temples still standing, but their loyalty bent toward Akkad. Yet Sargon's vision reached beyond the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. He had tasted conquest, and the taste was intoxicating. To stop at the boundaries of Sumer would have been to fall short of destiny. His armies marched further into lands that had only been whispered of in trade and song, until his name became known from the mountains to the sea. Eastward, he struck into Elam, a land of rugged hills and proud cities. The Elamites had long stood as rivals to the Sumerians, raiding their borders, trading with their merchants, and sometimes clashing in bitter wars. Sargon's armies marched against them with the same relentless discipline that had humbled Sumer. One after another, their cities fell, and Elam was drawn into the orbit of Akkad. For the first time, the Sumerians' ancient foe was not a rival, but a province within a greater whole. Northward, his banners climbed the slopes of the Zagros Mountains, where tribes watched the lowlands with wary eyes. These highland peoples were fierce, resistant to subjugation, but Sargon pressed into their valleys, claiming timber and stone, resources that Mesopotamia's flat plains could not provide. His soldiers must have marveled at the landscape so different from their home. Forests thick with trees, peaks capped with snow, rivers rushing down narrow gorges. Yet conquest did not come easily in these lands, and rebellions there would remain a constant thorn in the empire's side. Westward, his ambitions carried him farther still. The chronicles claim that Sargon marched all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean, a land the Akkadians called the Upper Sea. Whether myth or reality, the tale captured the imagination of his people. His soldiers, raised in the dust and rivers of Mesopotamia, would have gazed in awe at the endless waters stretching beyond sight, waves pounding upon shores, the smell of salt carried in the air. To them, it must have seemed like the edge of the world. If the stories are true, then Akkadian banners flew over cities that had never before felt the weight of Mesopotamian rule, and Sargon became master of lands that spanned from sea to sea. Even the distant north, where the great rivers were born, felt the pressure of his armies. Legend spoke of his reach into Anatolia, where silver and copper could be mined, where mountain passes opened into lands rich with goods unknown in Sumer. Though the details are clouded by time, the sense remains clear. Sargon's ambition knew no natural boundary. His empire was no longer confined to the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia. It was a world stretching far beyond. But with expansion came strain. The further his armies marched, the harder it became to control the lands behind them. Each conquered city had its pride, each priesthood its traditions, each people its desire for freedom. No matter how often rebellions were crushed, they would flare again, like embers refusing to die. The chronicles speak of widespread uprisings late in his reign, when all the cities of Sumer rose against him at once. Such unity among his enemies had rarely been seen, for the Sumerian cities were notorious for their rivalries. Yet their hatred of Akkadian domination brought them together in desperate defiance. The battles that followed must have shaken the land. Sargon, now an older man, still led his armies with iron will. The city-states fell one by one. Each rebellion drowned in blood, each defiance answered with ruthless retribution. By sheer force of will and the loyalty of his soldiers, he restored his dominion. It was a testament to his endurance, to the fear his name inspired, that even in the face of united resistance, the empire did not crumble, but the price was high. The cycle of rebellion and suppression revealed the fragility of his creation. The empire lived, but it lived under constant strain, its unity forced rather than embraced. In these later years, the legends tell us, Sargon grew restless. Having conquered so much, having ruled so widely, he sensed the precariousness of what he had built. No amount of power could still the undercurrent of rebellion. No decree could erase the bitterness of the conquered. He had created the first empire, but he also understood, perhaps more than anyone, how easily it could slip back into dust. Still, in the eyes of his people, Sargon was a figure larger than life. Inscriptions spoke of him as king of the world, ruler of the four quarters, master of lands from sunrise to sunset. His connection to the goddess Ishtar was emphasized more than ever, as if divine favor itself were the shield that protected his reign. To his enemies, he was a storm that could not be stopped. To his allies, he was the guarantor of order in a chaotic land. Yet to history, he stands as both. The conqueror who created the first empire, and the man whose ambition revealed both the glory and the burden of empire itself. The empire he had carved was a new experiment in human history. No one had attempted such unity before. No one had bent so many peoples into a single order. The Akkadian Empire was both fragile and enduring. Fragile in its constant rebellions, enduring in the model it left for those who came after. For though Akkad itself would one day vanish, the idea of empire would never again leave humanity's imagination. In the twilight of Sargon's reign, as he grew old and his sons prepared to inherit what he had built, the land still trembled with unrest. The first empire had been forged in fire, but whether it could survive without its founder remained an unanswered question. Yet in that moment, with Akkad at its height, with Sargon still commanding the loyalty of armies and the fear of kings, he stood unmatched, a colossus whose shadow fell across the world. The twilight years of Sargon of Akkad were filled with both triumph and unease. He had ruled longer than most kings of his age could dream, and in that time he had reshaped the destiny of humanity itself. From his victories had come the First Empire, stretching across the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and beyond, encompassing mountains, rivers, seas, and cities that had once thought themselves eternal masters of their own fate. Yet, as the seasons turned and the weight of years pressed upon him, the cracks in his creation began to show. For all its magnificence, the empire was a fragile giant, its strength dependent on his presence, his will, his armies, his vision. The legends say that in these later years, the cities of Sumer rose again in rebellion, united in their hatred of Akkadian rule. It was no small revolt of one defiant lord, but a collective storm, a desperate attempt to break free from the yoke of empire. The old cities with their temples and priests remembered the days before Akkad, when each city was sovereign, when their gods were not overshadowed by the divine favor claimed by one man. To them, Sargon was a usurper, a conqueror, an outsider who had bent their traditions to his will. Their uprisings were not only political, they were religious, cultural, existential. But Sargon, even in age, was unyielding. The chronicles tell us he crushed these rebellions with merciless strength, marching his armies once more across the plains of Sumer, tearing down resistance wherever it emerged. To lead such campaigns in the final years of his life was a testament to his endurance, to the loyalty he inspired in his soldiers. Yet it was also a sign of the empire's weakness, that even after decades of rule, its heartlands could still rise in revolt. Victory came at a price. The cycle of rebellion and suppression left scars that no amount of conquest could heal. When at last Sargon died, he left behind both glory and burden. His reign had set a new standard for kingship, a vision that would echo through centuries. The idea that one man could rule not just a city, but a world. But he also left behind an empire trembling with unrest, stretched thin by ambition, held together by fear and force. The question that loomed was whether his heirs could sustain what he had built, or whether it would crumble without the presence of the man who had forged it. The throne passed first to his son, Rimush. Where Sargon had been the founder, Rimush was the inheritor of rebellion. No sooner had he taken the crown than the cities rose again, testing the mettle of the new king. He fought with the same ruthlessness as his father, putting down uprisings with blood and fire, ensuring the Akkadian grip remained firm. Yet the resentment did not fade, and Rimush's reign was short, his rule marred by endless conflict. In the end, he met a violent death, struck down not by foreign enemies but, it is said, by conspirators within his own household. Even in succession, the fragility of empire revealed itself. After Rimush came Manishtushu, another son of Sargon. His reign brought relative stability, though the empire's challenges never ceased. He extended Akkadian influence further, pressing into lands beyond Mesopotamia, engaging in both conquest and diplomacy to maintain the fragile balance his father had created. Yet even his rule ended in blood, with assassination cutting short his reign. The throne of Akkad, though powerful, was perilous, a seat both coveted and cursed. It was only with Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, that the empire reached its second great height. Naram Sin, the heir of Sargon's vision, carried the Akkadian Empire into a new age, claiming not only kingship but divinity itself. Where Sargon had called himself the king of the four quarters, Naram Sin declared himself the god of Akkad, placing his authority beyond the reach of men. His victories were celebrated in stone, his campaigns immortalized on stelae, his image crowned with the horned helmet of divinity. In him, the ambition of Sargon found its boldest expression. Yet this was the fate of the first empire, built in fire, tested in rebellion, maintained through blood, and always haunted by fragility. The legacy of Sargon was not merely the empire itself, but the idea that empire could exist, that human ambition could stretch beyond the walls of a single city, beyond the reach of a single priesthood to claim dominion over all lands. It was a vision that could not be undone, even when Akkad itself fell into ruin. For generations, the name of Sargon would echo in the halls of kings, whispered as both a warning and an inspiration. To later rulers, he was the model of conquest, the embodiment of ambition, the founder of the very idea of empire. His story, half history and half myth, survived long after Akkad itself had vanished beneath the sands, long after its ruins were forgotten, long after its name became only a word carved on ancient tablets. But in the final years of his life, as the old king marched once more to put down rebellion, as his armies trampled the dust of lands he had conquered so many times before, perhaps he too wondered about the permanence of his creation. He had risen from obscurity to claim the world, but even the strongest walls crumble, even the greatest kings are mortal. His legacy, however, would endure, not in the permanence of his empire, but in the memory of what he had dared to attempt. When the throne of Akkad passed into the hands of Naram Sin, the grandson of Sargon, it was as though the torch of empire flared once more into brilliance. The shadow of Sargon still loomed across the land, his conquests remembered in songs and in scars. But Naram Sin was determined not merely to preserve his grandfather's legacy, he sought to surpass it, to elevate the Akkadian crown beyond the realm of mortal kingship. From the moment he ascended, his reign was one of relentless assertion. Where Rimush and Manishtushu had fought to hold together the brittle seams of empire, Naram Sin wielded its armies with a confidence born of inheritance and ambition. He struck out in all directions, leading campaigns that expanded Akkadian influence beyond anything Sargon had attempted. He marched into Elam once more, crushing the highland peoples who had so often resisted Akkadian dominance. He moved northward, pressing into the lands of the Hurrians and beyond. His campaigns were not merely defensive, they were imperial, a deliberate projection of Akkadian power into every horizon. But it was not only by the sword that Naram Sin made his mark. He was a master of symbolism, of the sacred language of kingship. Where his grandfather had been content to call himself the king of the four quarters, a title that evoked mastery over all lands, Naram Sin went further. He dared to claim divinity for himself, the first Mesopotamian ruler to wear the horned crown, the sacred symbol of the gods. In this bold act, he transformed the very concept of kingship. No longer was the king merely chosen by the gods, he was himself a god upon the earth. This act was as much political as it was religious. To declare himself divine was to elevate his authority above all rivals, above priests and temples, above the ancient traditions of Sumer. It bound the empire not just to a king, but to a living god. Yet such audacity carried with it a heavy burden. For if he was a god, then every misfortune, every defeat, every rebellion was not merely a political crisis. It was a cosmic challenge, a judgment on his divinity itself. The most enduring monument to his reign is the victory stele of Naram Sin, a towering slab of stone carved with images of his triumph. In it, he is shown ascending a mountain, trampling his enemies beneath him, his soldiers marching in perfect order behind their god-king. Above him, the stars, symbols of the divine, shine down, affirming his celestial power. It is a vision of kingship raised to its highest and most terrifying form. A mortal made immortal through conquest, a man whose very image radiated the aura of divinity. Yet history remembers Naram Sin not only for his glory, but for the curse that followed him. Among the tales preserved on clay tablets is the story of his great offense against the god Enlil, the lord of the winds and the keeper of divine order. According to this legend, the city of Nippur, Enlil's sacred city, rose in rebellion against Akkadian rule. Enraged by their defiance, Naram Sin marched upon the holy place and destroyed its temple, casting down the seat of Enlil's power. It was an act of sacrilege, an audacity even greater than his claim of divinity. The tale says that from this moment the wrath of the gods was turned against him. The Gutians, a mountain people from the distant east, descended upon Mesopotamia, their raids like a plague upon the land. Famine struck, harvests withered, the empire faltered. To the people of the time, these disasters were not mere misfortunes, but the inevitable punishment for Naram Sin's arrogance. He had overreached, he had defied the gods, and now the empire suffered the consequences of his hubris. Whether the story is history or myth, it captures a truth about empire itself. In Naram Sin's reign, the Akkadian Empire reached its zenith, but it also sowed the seeds of its downfall. The very act of centralizing such vast power in the hands of one man, one god-king, created a structure both magnificent and fragile. It depended upon the awe he inspired, the fear he commanded, the victories he could win. When the tide turned, when famine or invasion struck, the same aura that had elevated him became the cause of his undoing. Still, for decades, Naram Sin held the empire together, his campaigns extending Akkadian reach further than any ruler before him. In the annals of kings, he is remembered as both the most exalted and the most cursed, a man who stood at the pinnacle of human ambition and paid the price for reaching too high. His reign marked the second great flowering of Akkad, and with it came both triumph and tragedy, the echo of which would resound through the centuries. In the end, Naram Sin died as all kings do, but the memory of his god-king rule lingered. For some, he was a divine conqueror, a figure of awe. For others, a tyrant whose arrogance doomed his people. The truth lay somewhere between, a ruler who embodied both the greatness and the fragility of empire, who carried the vision of Sargon to its furthest extent and revealed the peril at its heart. The Akkadian Empire, though wounded, did not collapse immediately upon his death. It staggered onward, led by rulers who bore the weight of his legacy, struggling against enemies at their borders and rebellions within. But the decline had begun. The Gutians pressed harder, the harvests failed more often, the unity that Sargon had forged and Naram Sin had exalted began to unravel. The First Empire was entering its twilight, its grandeur giving way to ruin. The passing of Naram Sin marked more than the end of a reign. It marked the beginning of a long twilight for Akkad. The empire that had once seemed eternal, stretching from the mountains of the east to the Mediterranean shores, now began to tremble under forces both human and divine. For decades, the people of Mesopotamia had lived under the shadow of Akkadian kingship, a power unlike anything the world had known. But as the fortunes of Akkad waned, the memory of old freedom stirred in the hearts of the Sumerian cities, and enemies beyond the frontiers sensed weakness. The stories of the time speak of famine, of rivers that no longer flooded as they once had, of fields that yielded only dust. Whether these were the natural rhythms of climate or the scars of overworked land, to the people it was a sign of divine displeasure. The gods, it seemed, had turned against the empire. The arrogance of Naram Sin, who had dared to wear the crown of divinity, was remembered not as glory, but as sin, and his descendants inherited not only the throne, but the curse. Rebellions flared once more across Sumer. Cities that had been subdued by Sargon and Rimish and crushed again by Naram-Sin rose defiantly from the dust, as though the flame of resistance could never be extinguished. Each revolt was a reminder of the empire's fragility, of the truth that no people willingly submit forever. Akkadian armies still marched, still fought, still punished rebellion. But each campaign drained resources, strained loyalties, and spread unrest like wildfire. And from the eastern mountains came a new and terrible foe, the Gutians. They were a people of the highlands, described by later Sumerian scribes as savage and uncivilized, a scourge upon the land. To the Akkadians, who had built cities of stone and clay, raised temples to the heavens, and carved laws into tablets, the Gutians were chaos embodied. They descended in waves, plundering fields, sacking towns, disrupting the delicate balance of agriculture and trade that sustained Mesopotamian civilization. Whether they were truly the destroyers described by later accounts or simply opportunists seizing upon a moment of weakness, their raids became the hammer blows that shattered the empire's brittle frame. The kings who followed Naram-Sin, among them Shar-Kali-Shari, fought desperately to hold back the tide. Shar-Kali-Shari, his name meaning king of all kings, tried to live up to the mantle of his grandfather and his great-grandfather. But his reign was beset on all sides. He battled the Elamites to the east, the Amorites pressing from the west, and the Gutians who swept down from the Zagros mountains. It was a storm of enemies, and though he fought with determination, the empire was no longer what it had been. Its wealth was depleted, its armies stretched thin, its people weary of endless war. In the records of kingship, the reigns after Shar-Kali-Shari blur into shadow. The list of rulers grows uncertain, their reigns short, their authority contested. Akkad itself, once the heart of empire, faced famine so severe that it became a city of hunger. Clay tablets speak of grain sold at prices too high for common folk to afford, of fields abandoned, of despair etched into daily life. The city that Sargon had built as a beacon of empire became a place haunted by the memory of its own greatness. The Gutians, once raiders, became rulers, slipping into the vacuum left by Akkad's collapse. For a time, they held sway over Sumer and Akkad, though their rule was remembered as a dark age by later scribes. To the people who lived through it, it was an age of instability, of lost order, of gods seemingly absent from the land. The first empire had fallen, its dream shattered, its legacy buried beneath the rubble of rebellion and invasion. Yet empires, even in ruin, leave behind echoes that never fade. The Akkadian Empire may have collapsed, but it had transformed the idea of kingship forever. Sargon had shown that a ruler could command not just a city, but an entire world. Naram-Sin had demonstrated that kingship itself could brush against the divine. Even in their downfall, the Akkadians had planted the seed of empire so deeply into human memory that it would never be forgotten. In the south, among the ancient cities of Sumer, the people remembered. From the ashes of Akkad, a new power would rise, led by kings who claimed to restore what had been lost, who invoked both the glory and the warnings of Sargon's line. The fall of Akkad was not the end of empire. It was the beginning of a cycle, a lesson written in the clay of Mesopotamia. That power can rise from the humblest origins, that ambition can shape the destiny of nations, and that even the greatest of empires can fall. So the first empire ended, not in a single moment of destruction, but in a long unraveling, a twilight of famine, rebellion, and invasion. Its ruins were left for later generations to ponder, its kings remembered in both praise and condemnation. And through it all, the name of Sargon endured, a legend carried down through centuries, a story retold by every empire that came after, each one measuring itself against the man who had dared to be first. The fall of Akkad was not the end of Mesopotamia's story. Out of the ruins of the First Empire, new powers arose, each learning from the triumphs and failures of Sargon's line. Among the Sumerian cities that had once groaned under Akkadian rule, Ur stood tallest, and from its walls emerged a dynasty that would forge the next empire. The kings of Ur proclaimed themselves restorers of order, chosen by the gods to rebuild what Naram-Sin's arrogance had destroyed. They revived ancient traditions, reinstated temples, and honored the gods of Sumer with lavish offerings. Yet beneath this return to the old ways lay something new, a vision of centralized authority inspired by the Akkadian experiment. Where Sargon had wielded conquest as his tool, the kings of Ur wielded administration. They built not just through war but through bureaucracy, weaving together the cities of Sumer into a tightly governed state. At the height of this so-called Sumerian Renaissance, the third dynasty of Ur stretched its authority across much of Mesopotamia. Its rulers, like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, became legendary not only for their military campaigns, but for their reforms, their laws, their ability to blend the divine authority of kingship with the practical necessities of empire. Clay tablets from this era reveal a world meticulously ordered, grain counted, and recorded, workers assigned their duties, temples supplied with offerings, and law codes inscribed to ensure justice under the king's gaze. Ur-Nammu, founder of this dynasty, is remembered above all for his code of laws, one of the earliest known in history. His vision of justice carved into tablets bound the empire together not by fear alone, but by the promise of fairness, however imperfectly delivered. His son, Shulgi, carried this vision further, ruling for nearly half a century, during which he expanded the empire's borders and strengthened its cultural and religious foundations. To later generations, Shulgi was remembered as a poet, a patron of learning, a king who blended the sword with the stylus. The empire of Ur III, like that of Akkad before it, was a delicate balance of power and fragility. It flourished in administration and culture, but it too faced enemies beyond its borders, pressures from nomadic tribes and the unyielding cycles of famine and flood. Yet for a century it stood as the new beacon of Mesopotamian civilization, proof that empire was not a fleeting dream but a recurring destiny. In Ur, the lessons of Akkad lived on. The kings did not forget Sargon, nor did they ignore the curse of Naram-Sin. They sought to rule with divine sanction, but also with justice, to wield empire without provoking the wrath of the gods. Their achievements became a bridge between the world of the First Empire and the empires yet to come.